If you want to stalk some great new streaming content, then you need to get with today's video sponsor, Magellan TV. Magellan TV is a new documentary streaming service founded by filmmakers who love history. Their mission is to tell the great stories that have defined the human experience. And with more than 3,000 excellent programs available on Magellan, it's hard to stop once you start watching. They've got everything from the Greeks to the Great War, plus modern histories, biographies, scientific profiles, true crime, and so much more. And their team adds more content every week. And what's one thing to love about paid streaming services? No ads, just lots and lots of content. Now, I mentioned they've got some great true crime content, and for you guys today, I'd recommend checking out the docuseries 10 Steps to Murder on Magellan. It's 10 episodes featuring some of the most infamous murders in the world. Very murdery! If you're looking for less of a series and more of a movie, then why not check out The Family Inside the Manson Cult? Also a good one. Right now, you guys can get a 1-month free trial with Magellan by clicking the link in the description below. It's content for days and days, so let Magellan hook you up. You'll be glad you did. And now today's video. The Freeway Phantom is not among the most notorious names in crime, like the Zodiac or Jack the Ripper, and yet he managed to do the same thing they did. For a year and a half, he terrorized Washington, D.C., claiming at least 6 victims, and then, even though he had over 100 police officers and FBI agents on his tail, he simply disappeared, never to be heard from again. The murderous spree started on April 25th, 1971 in Washington, D.C. This was just one day after hundreds of thousands of people gathered in the nation's capital to protest the Vietnam War. Chaos and violence were the words of the day, but D.C. police would soon have another problem on their hands. Possibly the city's first ever serial killer who was abducting and murdering young black girls. His first known victim was 13-year-old Carol Denise Spinks. On April 25th, she went out on a short walk to the grocery store just 4 blocks away. She wasn't supposed to leave the house because her mum was not at home, but she decided to risk it since her older sister told Carol that she could buy herself a soda with the change. As soon as she walked out, her mother spotted her as she was returning home. Carol knew that whooping awaited her back at the house for disobeying, so she decided she might as well go get the groceries too. She was last seen by a neighborhood boy shortly after leaving the store. It was a distance of just half a mile, but it seems like Carol Spinks disappeared without a trace and without anyone ever seeing her abductor. Her mother knew that she should have returned in a few minutes, so she got worried. Once she realized that her daughter was missing, she called the police and organized a neighborhood search later that night. All of this proved to be in vain, as Carol Spinks was never seen alive again. Her body was found 6 days later, dumped behind a hospital on the embankment off Interstate 295, less than a mile away from where she had disappeared. She was still wearing the clothes she had gone missing in: gym shorts, a red sweater, and brown socks, although she did not have her tennis shoes on. An autopsy indicated that Carol Spinks had only been dead for 2 to 3 days, meaning that whoever kidnapped her kept her alive for around the same amount of time. Her stomach still contained partially digested food, suggesting that he had also fed her. Her body showed signs of sexual assault and defensive wounds to her face, neck, and hands, and she was killed by strangulation. Right off the bat, we can say that this investigation was tainted by incompetence, lack of resources, and a racial bias. The 2 detectives who were assigned to the murder of Carol Spinks were Roy Lamb and John Moriarty. They were told from the start to make it snappy, since they were needed for street patrol and to be on standby in case war protests erupted into riots. When Lamb and Moriarty first started working on the case, the body of the young girl had not been identified yet. However, it did not take long for them to make the ID based on the location, the clothes, and the physical description of Carol Spinks. They canvassed the neighborhood and talked to as many people as they could, but nobody remembered seeing anything useful. The only lead in the case came in the form of some green fibers found on Carol Spinks' clothes, believed to have come from the carpet of the car, which may have been used to transport her body. On July the 14th, it seemed like the killer had already struck again when the body of 14-year-old Angela Denise Barnes was discovered. Some things were similar and some things were different. The victim was another young black girl, and her body had been dumped near a highway again. She had not been strangled, however, but shot in the back of the head. An immediate connection was made between this murder and that of Carol Spinks, and the rest to come. And for a few years, Angela Barnes was considered to be one of the Phantom's victims. In 1974, however, something unexpected happened. Police announced that they had made 2 arrests in the Angela Barnes case. They were not only confident that they had apprehended the culprits, but they also insisted that this murder was not connected to the other killings. The killers were Edward Sullivan and Tommy Simmons, two former rookie cops who used to work for the patrol division of the Metropolitan Police Force. The men did not make it past their one-year probationary period in 1971 and were forced to resign after an incident involving missing revolvers. Simmons claimed that his gun had been stolen during a break-in, but the weapon was later found and matched to the Angela Barnes murder. He was arrested first, but police kept quiet on the details to avoid warning Sullivan that they were looking for a second shooter. Ultimately, the murder of Angela Barnes was ruled to be unrelated to the serial killings, but detectives didn't have to wait long for the real Freeway Phantom to strike again. By the time the body of Angela Barnes had been discovered, the Phantom had already chosen his next victim. She was 16-year-old Darlenia Denise Johnson, who lived in Congress Heights, the same neighborhood as Carol Spinks. On the morning of July the 8th, 1971, she disappeared while walking to her summer job as a counselor for the Oxon Hill Recreation Center. It wasn't until 11 days later that her body was found. It had been dumped off Interstate 295 again, landing just 15 feet away from where Carol Spinks was discovered. This was a prime example of the police's lack of interest in the case, because Darlenia's body had first been spotted and reported to the authorities a whole week earlier. Two people called the police on July the 12th and gave them the exact location. A unit went there and radioed a 10-8 message to dispatch, meaning they didn't find anything, which would have only been possible if they just drove by the area and didn't even bother to get out and look. A week later, one of the two callers drove by the location again and saw that the body was still there. They told their boss, who was one of their friends, who was a police sergeant, and he was the one who finally found Darlenia when he went to the area while he was off duty. By that point, the long time spent in the sweltering heat of midsummer left the body in an advanced state of decomposition, too advanced to tell investigators anything useful. At the very least, they could see that Darlenia Johnson had also been strangled. She was also wearing the same clothes as she did the day that she disappeared, minus her shoes. Given that the killing and disposal methods were identical between her and Carol Spinks, it seems highly likely that Washington, D.C. had a serial killer on its hands, but the Metro Police were not ready yet to reach this conclusion. They worked the leads they had, they looked into the boyfriend as a person of interest, then they checked in with the witness who claimed to have seen Darlenia in the company of an older black man driving away in an older model black sedan. Neither lead produced any results. Despite the police's reluctance to acknowledge the presence of a serial killer in DC, the Freeway Phantom had no intention of stopping or slowing down. Just 8 days after the discovery of Darlenia Johnson, 10-year-old Brenda Faye Crockett disappeared in a similar scenario to that of Carol Spinks. On the evening of July the 27th, Brenda's mother sent her to the nearby Safeway to buy some dog food. She vanished on her way to the store, leaving behind no traces and no witnesses. A short while later, her family realized that something went wrong and was out searching the neighborhood for any signs of the missing girl, and that is when the case took an unexpected turn. Brenda's younger sister, Bertha, stayed behind at home, and she received a phone call. She answered, and she heard her sister's voice at the other end of the line. Brenda was crying, but she stopped enough to say that a white man picked her up, that she was in Virginia, and that she was coming home in a cab. That did not make a lot of sense, since Virginia was over 170 miles away, and Brenda had been missing for less than 3 hours. Still, a short while later, the phone rang again. This time, the mother's boyfriend answered and spoke to Brenda, although she mainly repeated what she'd already said before, this time ending the call with a reassuring, "I'll see you." This gave the family hope that Brenda might return home safe and sound, but their hopes were crushed the very next morning when the young girl's lifeless body was found on US Route 50 near the Baltimore-Washington Parkway in Prince George's County. She had been strangled and sexually assaulted, although this time the scarf that was used to kill her was left tied around her neck. Like before, she was wearing her own clothes, but she didn't have any shoes on, and police found traces of green fibers on her. But unlike the others, it appears that Brenda's body had been washed clean prior to being dumped in a very public area so that it would be found quickly. Police speculated that the differences in the modus operandi could mean that the killer had some sort of connection to the Crockett family. Since it happened so quickly after the death of Darlenia Johnson, it was possible that the abduction of Brenda Faye Crockett had been an impulse decision, one perhaps committed in the Phantom's own neighborhood. That is why he acted with a sense of urgency, and he got rid of her quickly while taking extra steps to clean the body. And what about the phone calls? Were they a sign of the Phantom's increasing sadism as he wanted to inflict more anguish on the family of the victim? This is possible, although the police thought the most likely scenario was an attempt from the killer to provide them with false information, further strengthening their hypothesis that the murderer knew the Crockett family. After killing Brenda Faye Crockett, the Freeway Phantom took a short break and did not claim another victim until October. It was October the 1st, actually, when 12-year-old Nenomoshia Neno Yates went missing. Her story was a familiar one. It was evening, and her father had asked her to go to the nearby Safeway and pick up a few groceries because he had to go to the hospital where Neno's stepmother had just had a baby. It seemed simple enough. The Safeway was at the end of the street. The young girl made it there and bought all the items, but then her groceries were found discarded on the street in front of the store. It looked like the Phantom abducted her soon after she left the Safeway, once again without being noticed by anyone. One neighbor thought they saw the girl get into a blue Volkswagen, but this lead never went anywhere. This time, the killer did not hold his victim hostage. Nenomoshia Yates' body was found just 2 hours later by a hitchhiker dumped off the shoulder of Pennsylvania Avenue. Once again, the Phantom had crossed state lines into Maryland, but it remains unclear if he did this out of convenience or if he did it on purpose to complicate the investigation. All the signs of the other murders were there. The girl had been sexually assaulted and strangled, her shoes were missing, and there were green fibers on her body. It was at this point that the authorities could no longer deny the fact that they were dealing with a serial killer. When pressed for answers by the press, Detective John Rossi said that there is some reason to believe that there is some connection to some similar deaths. A few important developments followed this admission. For starters, the FBI was brought in, even though it too was pretty new when it came to hunting down serial killers. More notably, the newspapers decided to give the murderer a name. The Washington Daily News came up with the Freeway Phantom, a moniker that was embraced not just by the media, but by the killer himself. His fifth murder was the most brutal. On November the 15th, 18-year-old Baltimore resident Brenda Denise Woodard left home in the evening to attend a night class at Cardozo High School in D.C. She and a friend got some dinner afterwards and then took the bus home. At one point, Brenda got off the bus to catch a transfer, and that was the last time she was ever seen alive. Her body was found early the next morning by a patrol car dumped off an access ramp onto Route 202 near Prince George's Hospital. Brenda had suffered the same fate as the other victims, but she had also been stabbed multiple times. Was the excess violence a sign of the killer's increasing sadism, or was it a necessity? Brenda Woodard was the oldest of the Phantom's victims, and her body was covered in defensive wounds, so perhaps her attacker stabbed her because he could not easily subdue her like the rest. Her shoes were also still on her feet, so at first, police toyed with the idea that this might be an unrelated murder. However, then they discovered the most unusual development in the case. Inside Brenda's coat pocket, the killer had left them a note, which read, "This is tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women. I will admit the others when you catch me if you can. Freeway Phantom." This was the biggest departure from his usual MO. It showed that the killer was a fan of the name the press had found for him. Based on writing analysis handled by the FBI, investigators concluded that the note had been written by Brenda Woodard and dictated by the Phantom. They also speculated that the victim knew the killer and was somewhat relaxed in his presence because the writing did not show any significant signs of hesitation, nervousness, or duress. To some, this was a promising lead, but others still believed that Brenda Woodard might not have been a victim of the Freeway Phantom and that, instead, her true killer did everything they could to incriminate him. Something else unusual happened after Brenda Woodard's death. The Freeway Phantom stopped. Months passed with no new developments, so the FBI had to move on to something else, particularly since by that point the Watergate scandal had erupted. Meanwhile, the local police's investigation had reached a dead end, and with no new leads, it seemed like the Phantom had escaped their clutches. Then, on September the 5th, 1972, 10 months after his last murder, the killer struck again. The victim was 17-year-old Diane Denise Williams, who disappeared while returning home from her boyfriend's house. Her body was found the following day by a trucker in a similar place as the others, a grassy incline off Interstate 295. She showed the same signs of sexual assault and strangulation as the other victims. Her shoes had been removed, but in this case, they were found discarded next to the body. After Diane Williams' murder, the Freeway Phantom disappeared once more, permanently this time as far as we know. These are the 6 killings generally ascribed to him, although some investigators argue that another teenager named Teara Ann Bryant was also killed by the same man. The 18-year-old girl was found under a bridge on November the 26th, 1972. She is the only victim whose body was not dumped near a freeway, so that might be why some don't think that she was a victim of the Phantom. In 1974, when the Watergate investigation died down, the FBI rejoined the hunt for the killer with a renewed zeal. Over 100 investigators from 5 different agencies formed a task force to catch the Freeway Phantom. A reward was offered for any useful information. A tip line was set up which received thousands of calls. All leads were pursued, establishing a list numbering hundreds of persons of interest. All this proved to be in vain, as the Freeway Phantom remains as elusive today as he ever was when he began his killing spree. Perhaps the most solid suspect, one that many investigators considered to be the likely culprit, was identified in 1977. His name was Robert Elwood Askins, and he worked as a computer technician for St. Elizabeth's Hospital, the same hospital near the place where the first victim was found. Although he appeared quite genial at first, Askins had a dark past, having served time in a mental institution and to prison for poisoning a prostitute back in 1938. Askins fit the profile. He was a middle-aged black man who lived in the same area as some of the girls and had a deep-seated hatred for women that started when he contracted a venereal disease from a prostitute as a young man. He ended up on the police's radar in 1977 when he kidnapped, beat, and raped a 24-year-old woman in his house before letting her go. But perhaps the most unexpected connection was that Askins loved to use the word tantamount, according to his documents and his colleagues. This was an unusual word that had also been used in the written messages left by the Freeway Phantom inside Brenda Woodard's coat. Investigators really liked Askins for the murders, so they executed a search warrant on his home. They found a lot of suspicious stuff: women's scarves, pictures of unknown women and girls, even some jewelry in the backseat of his car, but frustratingly, nothing that could positively connect him to any of the victims. They were perhaps hoping to locate some of the missing shoes, or better yet, something that matched the green fibers found on the bodies, but alas, they had no such luck. One small consolation was that Robert Askins was found guilty of kidnapping and rape and spent the rest of his life in prison, so if he was the Phantom, he did not evade justice. Another popular hypothesis claims that the killer might have been a member of a gang known as the Green Vegas. These men were responsible for multiple abductions and rapes in DC and Maryland, and garnered their name from the Green Vega that they would cruise around in looking for victims. They were eventually arrested and imprisoned, and behind bars, one of them started talking. The inmate, whose name was Morris Warren, claimed that one of the other members was responsible for at least some of the murders. He provided the police with information and even took them to the areas where some of the victims were dumped, according to a 1975 memorandum by DC Judge Fred Agast, who wrote, "On May the 16th, he took them to the areas where Brenda Woodard, a homicide victim, had allegedly been kidnapped, raped, and murdered. On May the 17th, he showed them the alleged locations dealing with Darlenia Johnson, although while showing them where her body was abandoned, he took them to the place where Brenda Crockett's body was found. Both Ms. Johnson and Ms. Crockett were victims of the so-called Freeway Phantom homicides." This lead never panned out because Warren stopped cooperating. He was only ready to name names in exchange for total immunity, something prosecutors were unwilling to give him. But he also got cold feet once word got out that a prisoner was talking to the police, thanks to an overzealous politician who divulged the information to the media during election season. Ultimately, opinions on Warren remained divided. Obviously, he became a suspect himself, but he appeared to have solid alibis for some of the murders. Some of the stuff he told investigators turned out to be false, so skeptics think that the rest was just publicly available information or clever guesswork. Others believe that Warren showed insider knowledge of the crimes, which suggested that he had to have some kind of involvement, and that most likely the Freeway Phantom was one or more members of the Green Vegas. Not a lot of progress has been made in the investigation in the decades that followed. Modern forensics have been unable to lend a helping hand due to the poor management of evidence back in the 1970s. Since so many different agencies were involved, important evidence was passed around from one place to another. A lot of files have been lost or intentionally discarded, and the few DNA samples that they have may become too tainted to ever yield anything useful. The last time a DNA test was attempted in this case was 2009, and since no results were made public, we can safely assume that it didn't go anywhere. A solution is not completely out of reach, but for the time being, the identity of the Freeway Phantom remains a mystery. So I really hope you found that video interesting. Thanks again to Magellan TV for sponsoring it. Also, if you enjoyed this content, I've got a true crime podcast called The Casual Criminalist. We cover stuff like this, obviously, but in the podcast form. I'll link to that as well below, and thank you for watching.